Hello, Base Gardener here. I'm going to do another installment in the Time to Wake Up Canada video series I'm working on. And today I want to talk about division. So, as I'm sure many of us are aware, we as Canadians right now are being divided along multiple lines. And this is true across the West. But let's take, for example, here in Canada, we have Indigenous versus non-Indigenous Canadians. We have immigrants versus Canadian citizens. We have people who support Israel versus people who support Palestine. Um, you know, uh, and there's all kinds of these, right? You've got Quebecers and separatists, versus the rest of Canada. I could go on. Uh, Now, I'm not trying to unveil a conspiracy here. I don't know whose interests this benefits, but what I do know is that a divided society is more easy to control. So you can't really develop a cohesive organic movement when there's a bunch of infighting, right? And so that means while we're busy, arguing among one another, Brookfield Asset Management is using Canadian pension funds to backstop a bunch of their crappy green investments. Uh, and there's all kinds of this type of stuff, shady backroom deals. There was a reason why Justin Trudeau's government was so unpopular, right? Everyday Canadians were feeling hit from every angle in their pocketbooks, in terms of the culture war stuff, their kids' experience at school. Um, a divided society is easier to control. It's as simple as that. And so I think we need to resist these forces of division. And so I'm going to give a personal experience here. And this is one that really hits close to home for me. So I've been fairly vocal about the Cowichan decision that came down recently here in British Columbia, where I live. That decision is incredibly divisive because it's taken the interests of one First Nations group, and that court case has basically said that people who live in the affected area of Richmond no longer are the title holders for their land. Some people might say that's too extreme of an interpretation, but when I've looked into this, essentially what has been decided is that First Nations land claims are a prior and primary right of title over that property. And so even though the First Nation may say, well, we're not going after anybody's property, that doesn't matter. If this decision has changed the title of people's private property, then things like lenders for people's mortgages, people are being denied renewal for their mortgages. This is something that's already happening, and we're going to continue to see more of that because banks cannot recognize dual title over a property like that. There's too much uncertainty. They don't know if the property values are going to maintain when people go to sell. This is a big problem. Now, what I find so hurtful about the way the situation is unfolding is that the narrative that gets pumped to us through the media is that you need to go along with the Reconciliation Project if you want to be an ally to First Nations people. That is an incredibly divisive narrative. People are allowed to have an opinion on these things, especially when it affects them personally. Now, me as an individual, I've always had a huge amount of wonderful First Nations people as friends, some of the closest people to me in my life. And I'll love them forever, regardless of any of these other things that are going on around us. But when people start to believe these narratives, and they believe that, well, if this person is speaking out against the Cowichan decision, well, then they're not an ally of First Nations people. It's a point of division that is so sad. We need to support one another, and it's entirely reasonable for people to raise objections to political and judicial overreach, as we're seeing what's happening with the Cowichan decision right now. So, how do we as individuals combat this division? Well, I would say that one thing we need to be able to do is hold two seemingly opposing ideas in our head at the same time. Some people might call this being a hypocrite. I don't see it that way. So to me, this is where I'm coming from. I'm always going to have a lot of love, care, respect for the First Nations people of Canada who, in my experience, have just been wonderful people, and they have very valid concerns about their relationship with the government, and and reconciliation is an important thing, right? This is true, but it's also true that we, as non-Indigenous Canadians, what have you, also have a right to represent, a responsibility to our families, to one another, to represent our own interests to the best of our ability. And that means it's important that we stick up for our private property, even if that goes against the interests of First Nations people, Indigenous Canadians. Okay? So that's the way I look at it. And I think that's true for all these points of division. You can hold two ideas in your head at the same time. It's called nuance. It's recognizing that these things are complex. We're not necessarily going to agree, but it doesn't mean that we've somehow become enemies. I really think that's important. And to any of my First Nations friends who might happen to see this, my love for you has in no way diminished due to this crazy political situation we find ourselves in right now. And regardless of how it unfolds, that's not going to change. But I will also uphold my duty to my family to protect the rights to my private property as a British Columbian, as a Canadian. So, just some food for thought. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be divided in this way. It's not serving our best interests. I don't know whose best interests it serves. Probably our political elites in this country. Perhaps some secretive cabal. There's all kinds of conspiracies about this stuff, but that's not what I'm talking about today. It's just about the fact that, again, a divided society is easier to control. So those are my thoughts on that. I'd love to hear any feedback. Take care. All the best.